Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News, here in our beautiful JNS studios in Jerusalem, along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. We're back in Jerusalem. We're back in studio. Alex, it's been an unbelievable week here. You just got back off a plane from Washington, D.C., where you got a ride back, actually, with Prime Minister Netanyahu and a select group of journalists covering the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu as he made his way to Washington, D.C., meeting with President Donald Trump. Alex, welcome back. How was the trip?
Thank you. It's good to be back. It was a good trip. Just for the record, there's no movies on the plane. On the Wings of Zion, there's very spotty internet on the Wings of Zion. We didn't, unfortunately, get to meet the Prime Minister while he was on the trip with his wife, Sarah. They were in the Prime Minister's quarters in the front of the plane. But there was over 100 people, maybe even over 150 people that had joined the Prime Minister's delegation, most of them security. And then, as you mentioned, there was advisors and a select group of journalists. And it was definitely a privilege to be on with the Prime Minister on what I believe was a historic visit to Washington, D.C.
First, Alex, over the weekend, 3 Israeli hostages released from the dungeons, the hellholes of Hamas, the prisons in Gaza. Or Levi, Eli Sharabi, and Ohad Ben Ami, just terrible images of the 3 men who were obviously very, very frail, emaciated, and just horrible sights there. Hamas using the propaganda again, psychological terror against the state of Israel, releasing the 3, very, very frail. And we saw the images, a lot of social media comparing what we saw over the weekend to some of the images from the Holocaust. Basically, just horrible images there. It's great to have the hostages home, those 3, but obviously they were living on hell on earth.
Well, you see why it was so important to get these hostages back. I mean, how much longer could they have survived under these conditions? And, you know, we kind of knew that with the first release of the hostages at the beginning of this deal that we were getting the hostages back, the ones that were in better condition, the ones that were well fed. But here you're starting to see this is really how most of the hostages were kept. Many of them were kept in tunnels, some of them chained up. There was a picture of the 3 of them staying in one tiny room, which clearly was like an underground prison cell. And, you know, there's been calls now to get all the hostages back immediately. Right. And that makes sense. And I think that the Prime Minister would get the hostages back immediately. But now you have to go and look at how was this deal constructed to begin with. This was a deal that even now Steve Witkoff and others are saying was on the basis of a deal that was proposed by the Biden administration back in May. And so now you can understand why you're seeing this slow drip of hostages over a period of 6 weeks. And the reason why is because the Biden administration wanted a guarantee that Israel was going to keep a ceasefire for a period of 6 weeks, right? So the only way that you get Israel to not go back in and finish the job and hold the ceasefire over a period of 6 weeks is if the hostages are dripped out, 3 at a time. So that's what we're seeing here. We believe that 25 out of the 33 hostages that were promised in the first 6-week phase of the deal are alive. I think we've gotten back something like 16 of the hostages.
We're now up to 21, according to the last report.
21 because there was 5 Thai hostages, which were released under a separate deal, not included in the 33. So 16 of the Israeli hostages back so far. And you know, I only shiver to think what is the condition of other hostages that we might get back this week or the next week. And then there's going to be bodies of hostages that are going to start coming back soon. But I know that the Prime Minister wants to get these hostages back. I also know that both Netanyahu and the American team led by Steve Witkoff are not committed to maintaining the initially brokered phases of the deal, meaning that obviously there's a phase 1 that was agreed upon and negotiated, but now the Prime Minister sending a team is going to be led by Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer to Doha. to start negotiating on phase 2 of the deal, or possibly on some kind of extension of phase 1. But I do not believe that Israel is going to commit to a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, as was supposed to be negotiated in phase 2. And we have to see what kind of pressure the Americans will put on Qatar in particular, as well as on Hamas, in order to see if we can speed up the return of any remaining living hostages.
So that being said, though, Israel did release 183 Arab terrorists, including 18 serving life sentences over the weekend. At the same time, we saw the images yesterday on TV, the IDF redeploying from the strategic Netzarim corridor in central Gaza. That, in fact, did take place per what Israel agreed to in phase 1. And as you mentioned, an Israeli delegation did arrive in Qatar, in Doha, on Saturday night to continue negotiations and moving forward to phase 2. So all that is happening as we are now headed towards that second phase, perhaps.
And I think that the Netanyahu administration views the release of the hostages, which we've talked about as being an unjust and immoral deal, as being a bump in the road on a larger deal. And I think that the hostage deal itself, if it was viewed in a vacuum, similar to the way we had this Gilad Shalit deal back in 2011, you had a long-standing hostage crisis over several years where you had one soldier. Israel released 1,000 terrorists to get back the one soldier, Gilad Shalit, and everybody panned the deal, and it was a terrible deal. And in a way, it looks like this deal in some way models or follows the framework of that original deal. But I think that it's important to note that this deal comes on the heels of an Israeli military campaign, and we're now starting to see the images of what Israel actually has accomplished in Gaza, really demolishing a large portion of the Gaza Strip and killing in the process, by their estimates, about 18,000 terrorists. And now Israel's releasing 1,000 of the people that were that were arrested during the war, and is releasing another 900 prisoners, which is terrible. But I think that that deal is going to be judged not on the release itself in a vacuum, but rather as compared to it in the framework of what happened before the release, and then also what happens after the release, and we'll start to talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah, so the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, again, is Israel's prime minister, the first foreign leader to meet with newly inaugurated President Trump. Netanyahu also met with senior Trump administration officials, evangelical leaders, student leaders during his visit. And the top headline here in Israel and in the United States was Trump's plan, at least on paper, about what will happen in Gaza the day after. You're talking about his vision of relocating the Arabs in Gaza to foreign countries, rebuilding Gaza. He had this whole vision, which he announced during following meetings between himself and the prime minister. Let's jump out to a video in regard to Trump's statements.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
Prime Minister Netanyahu describing the meetings with President Trump as a great turning point for the Jewish state and encouraging observers to listen very well to the American leader's proposal to relocate Arabs out of the Gaza Strip. In addition, the Prime Minister is saying he discussed the dangers of a nuclear Iran. Those are the two key points: preventing Iran from going nuclear and what will happen to Gaza the day after. Let's listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
כפי שאתם יודעים, נפגשתי שלשום עם הנשיא טראמפ בפגישה היסטורית שהיא תפנית אדירה לעתיד ישראל. הוא העלה בפגישה הזאת גם את הרעיון שלו לגבי עזה, לגבי היום שאחרי חמאס. ואני חושב שכדאי להקשיב טוב טוב לרעיון הזה, שהוא הרעיון המקורי הראשון שעלה מזה שנים. ומשם הלכתי לבית הנבחרים, שם פגשתי גם את ראשי הקונגרס וגם את ראשי הסנאט, רפובליקנים ודמוקרטים כאחד, וכולם הסכימו אותי על שני דברים. אחד, אסור שלאיראן יהיה נשק גרעיני, ושתיים, החמאס חייב להיות מחוסל, הוא לא יכול להיות שם בעזה.
Okay, Alex, let's hear it. You were there, you were in the room. You have those two major issues. Iran, number one, preventing Iran from going nuclear, and President Trump's vision of Gaza, whether it takes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to rebuild Gaza, relocating an entire population outside of Gaza, the United States potentially taking over Gaza, rebuilding it, and then doing something with it. Not exactly sure what, if that's, if the United States envisions, or President Trump envisions Gaza becoming the 51st state, if they're going to build a resort town, some sort of Singapore or Hong Kong in Gaza. I mean, what do you take away? You were there. What do you take away from the president's comments? Is he just coming up with some sort of vision? Is he trying to get all the sides together? What do you make of everything that happened there?
Okay, well, let's start with Iran, because you mentioned it first. I think that the two administrations are both in an agreement that the Biden administration was not necessarily in agreement on with Netanyahu. It seemed as though the Biden administration was letting Iran creep towards a nuclear weapon, even as they were making statements that they didn't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Here, I do believe that Trump proved that he is willing to be more resolute and that this is a red line and that he literally will not let Iran get a nuclear weapon. I think that there might have been some disagreement behind closed doors between the two administrations on, how do you prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? It could be that Netanyahu was looking for a green light for a strike against Iran's nuclear sites, believing that the red lines have already all been crossed, and you've already seen the reports in the New York Times and elsewhere over the last week that Iran may be advancing and racing to get to a bomb faster, maybe a cruder weapon. So the timetable here could be very short. Of course, they've been saying, the Netanyahu's been crowing about this for maybe 20 years already. But Trump seeming to believe that the threat of crippling economic sanctions, and I believe some of the sanctions have already put on, is the right way to potentially negotiate with Iran a neutralizing or a removal of their own nuclear program. So I think that there could be some disagreement on that. And we have to see now how Iran responds to the president's sanctions. And I think that if Iran reacts in a way in which they're sort of trying to accommodate the U.S. president and making steps towards the president, they might be able to stretch this out a little bit. And who knows what they will do in terms of their illicit development of a nuclear weapon. It could be very dangerous. At the same time, if Iran responds to the president with belligerence and starts to aggravate the president, maybe the president will turn around and give Israel a green light. And we saw it just even after the press conference, there's been some statements by Trump saying, listen, it's either you take down your own nuclear program or we green light an Israeli strike. So this is something that we're going to have to watch over the next several weeks. But you mentioned the relocation plan, and that's something that Trump had mentioned in the lead up to the meeting, but it was certainly where he put the majority of his focus on, both in the Oval Office ahead of the two leaders' private meeting, and then in the large press conference, which took place on the East Wing of the White House afterwards. I had the privilege of both being in the Oval Office ahead of the meeting with a very small group of journalists, and then being part of like the larger press pool in that press conference. And in both cases, Trump spending a lot of time focusing on the relocation plan. Now, after the press conference, Netanyahu stated that they were not surprised that Trump was speaking about the relocation plan. It's a plan that the two leaders had spoken about ahead of that meeting. I think maybe what the surprise was, as you mentioned, how much time he spent on it. And then it seemed like the president was sort of ruminating on his own plan during the press conference, talking about building a Riviera on the Gaza Strip, and then also, I think, surprising the prime minister when he said that the United States would take some kind of ownership over the Gaza Strip. And you saw the prime minister make this double take, really, when the president said that. That said, the prime minister saying this is the first good idea that's happened really since the war started. And I think that this really should be couched differently. It's because you're starting to see now the accusation shifting from genocide against Israel to ethnic cleansing, forced resettlement, forced transfer. And the prime minister, in clarifying, I think, even the president's remarks in a small briefing that he gave to American press corps, including the New York Times and Reuters. I also was privileged to take part in that briefing. He said, this isn't ethnic cleansing. This isn't forced transfer or resettlement. This is about opening the gates. The prime minister said, for many years, people have talked about Gaza being an open air prison. He said, the reason why it's called an open air prison is because people are not allowed to leave. He said people should be allowed to leave if they want to. And the prime minister went on to say he knows that people want to leave because even before the war, he was continuously getting requests from people that wanted to leave the Gaza Strip and didn't have the opportunity to do so. We don't know how this is all going to pan out, but the president, Steve Witkoff, also the U.S. Middle East envoy, both of them calling Gaza a demolition site, saying that the whole thing needs to be knocked down. It's going to take some 10 to 15 years to rebuild, and nobody can live there. And the reasons why nobody can live there is because of just all of the concrete and the metal and everything that's just there on the ground. And then also there's a lot of unexploded ordnance all over the Gaza Strip, making it very dangerous for people to stay. And, now it's raining in Israel. And I think that this rain actually in this cold, rainy season will exacerbate the situation. And I do think that you're going to start to hear more and more cries for Gazans to be able to get out of the Strip.
So you do have President Trump scheduled to meet with the president of Egypt and Jordan in the days and weeks ahead.
Right.
Because both of those leaders have said they don't want any part of this plan.
Right. The King of Jordan is coming to the White House already on this coming Tuesday, just 1 week after Netanyahu's meeting. And the president has a lot of leverage over both Jordan and Egypt. So while the two of those leaders are saying, no way, no how, there will not be any Palestinians in our territory, both of those countries rely significantly on the United States for financial aid, for military assistance, particularly Egypt. One of the most unintended benefits or consequences of this war has been that the Houthis have interrupted the international shipping channel of the Suez Canal. Okay, the Suez Canal is one of Egypt's largest revenue drivers. Okay, so Egypt has been losing tons of money since the beginning of this war because ships are not going through Suez Canal. Now, Egypt should have been bombing the Houthis over the loss of this revenue, but the economic situation before the war for Egypt was not good. Now it's even worse. Egypt took some $1.5 billion loan just a few weeks ago. So the United States, I think, has a lot of leverage. And there's even been a plan that was floated years ago about some extension of Gaza into El Arish. There's a lot of space in the Sinai Desert. So if there will be a will, there will be a way. And Trump has this way of using economic leverage of the United States to change the will of foreign leaders. So I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see if there will be destinations available for Palestinians to be able to leave the Strip.
Israel seems to be taking the plan seriously. At a briefing on Thursday, the Israel Defense Forces presented Defense Minister Israel Katz with a draft plan for a safe passage consisting of the Ramon Airport and near Eilat and the Ashdod port. In other words, Israel is coming up with plans perhaps to allow Arabs in Gaza to leave to some of these other countries if in fact it comes to that.
Right. Now, the natural pathways for Gazans to go, it would be first to the south through their border with Egypt. If Egypt refuses to facilitate the transfer of Gazans, then Israel has to come up with other directions. Right now, some kind of land bridge could be created to get Palestinians living in Gaza to Jordan, right? And that could be facilitated, on buses or trucks or whatever it is. But if Jordan also refuses, should it be then that if those two countries, refuse, that they have the total veto on the resettlement of Gaza? So it's, I think, very important for Israel to be coming up with two different possibilities for how to get Gazans out of the Strip. The Ramon Airport, that's the one near Eilat. And Israel saying that it will facilitate the Gazans being able to fly out of Israel. And then also the Ashdod port, which is something, I don't know how many miles, maybe 50 miles away from the Gaza Strip, maybe less, to be able to facilitate Gazans being able to leave via port.
I want to talk about your article. You wrote an analysis, and I don't think we can hit all these different points because we're probably going to do just an entire show on this. But really, what it comes down to here, and the things that you learned on your trip, the differences between the Biden administration and their policies towards Israel and what you saw in just a few weeks of the Trump administration. The title of the article is "What Has Netanyahu Accomplished with Game-Changing Trump Meeting?" Go to jns.org and check it out. And I want to talk about specifically, we touched on some of the issues already. I want to talk about the rearmaments, the sanctions relief, the diplomatic backing, which we now have under the Trump administration. Take as we talked about the demolition zone and what Gaza is now, but take as some of these issues, if you can, and break them down in terms of how things have changed only in 3-4 weeks, in terms of what we saw under 4 years of Biden and only 3 weeks of the Trump administration, and how they affect the state of Israel. If you could pick some of the key points, sure, and break down where we are now as opposed to where we were.
I also had the privilege of being able to cover the Prime Minister's last trip in July, where he addressed the joint sessions of Congress, and then he had a meeting with President Biden, who had just announced that he was not going to be participating in the 2024 election. And he had a meeting with Kamala Harris. And then Harris, after Netanyahu left the White House, then issued a 6-minute press statement, which was a pretty terse press statement, basically saying, I told Netanyahu, get the deal done, and I think that the main difference, first of all, even if you did not hear what the two administrations had said in either of their meetings, the main difference that you could pick up on was the smiles. Okay. You saw that the Biden administration, with Harris and Blinken, sitting opposite the table with Netanyahu and Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, this was an adversarial relationship. The Biden administration presenting itself as what I would call a reluctant ally of the state of Israel. And the mood here in this last meeting was very different. This was about allies and even more than allies, even friends. And if you look at the people that are on Netanyahu's team right now, including Ron Dermer, including JNS senior contributing editor Carolyn Glick, who's now Netanyahu's international affairs advisor, specifically going to be dealing with the Trump administration. Ofer Falk, the foreign policy advisor, the newly appointed ambassador of Israel to the United States, Yechiel Leiter. What do all those individuals have in common? They're all American born. They all speak American English. They're all politically conservative. And so you have these two teams sitting in the room that really do see eye to eye with each other and know how to speak each other's language. They're together culturally, and I think that it's going to be an amazing alliance now between these two administrations, and they're both prepared to work together to advance the goals of both countries. It's a very different environment than you had before. So once you have that, now you can start working on all of the various issues. And obviously, key issue to Israel was the rearmaments. And the rearmament issue was the reason why Netanyahu was willing to pause the war in the last weeks of the Biden administration, to get to some kind of a ceasefire, both in Lebanon and in Gaza in order to give Israeli soldiers a rest. Israeli soldiers have been fighting for 15 months. Some of them not even home for 10 months of that 15-month period. So get them home, and then also to replenish the weapon storages, which were getting dangerously low and making Israel very vulnerable. Israel putting its foot on the gas, knowing that it was running out of weapons. And now I think it's clear not only that the Trump administration is releasing the weapons that the Biden administration withheld. The Biden administration was claiming it was only one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs. It's becoming very clear, as stated both by Netanyahu's team and by Trump's team, that that's not the case. It was a lot of weapons in a lot of different ordinances. And now there's even the possibility, and what's being floated out there, and I don't have confirmation of this, that the United States, the Trump team, is willing to release some bunker busting bombs to Israel that will actually help Israel if it decides to attack Iran's nuclear facilities.
Do you think that at the end of the day, this new administration in Washington will get to a point where they declare that the Oslo Accords once and for all are null and void, that Oslo is dead, that this whole concept, which we've been going down for now 30 plus years, the Oslo Accords signed in the 1990s, and which have absolutely failed, the whole concept of a two-state solution, which President Trump, by the way, he was asked, I believe, at one of these press conferences, do you believe in a two-state solution? And he said something like, well, we're still going to explore that issue. We're going to explore the issue of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Do you think at the end of the day, we're finally going to get it off that path of two-state solution, Oslo Accords? I mean, what's your sense after hearing the president speak?
Well, in the prime minister's briefing with American press, he was asked a similar question, and he basically said that the situation has changed completely. He said, you want to know what a Palestinian state would look like? He said basically the pilot project for a Palestinian state was Gaza. So we know what a Palestinian state is going to look like. He thinks the situation has changed. And I think that even if you read into the president's remarks, he said that he's not necessarily committed to a two-state solution. He may, in fact, try to see to the creation of a Palestinian state, but there's a little bit of a vagueness there about where a Palestinian state might be located, right? If you're going to start to relocate Gazan citizens into Egypt or somewhere else, maybe into some parts of Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, maybe some kind of Palestinian state is created in a different place, okay? But I think the idea of Israel ceding its territory in Judea and Samaria in order to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state, no, I don't think that that's on the immediate table. And that's one of the big differences also between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Biden administration was looking at how to parlay this conflict into the creation once and for all of a Palestinian state, believing that the reason why this attack happened is because Israel has always foiled the creation of a Palestinian state and that it finally has to happen. And I think that this administration, the Trump administration, understands that the reason why there's no Palestinian state is not because Israel's been unwilling to give up strategic territories. Israel's proven that it's willing to give up territories that it shouldn't be willing to give up. But rather that it's this Palestinian intransigence, it's their incitement and commitment to terrorism that has prevented the creation of a Palestinian state. And the hope is now that the door will finally be closed on this horrific Oslo process.
You mentioned the lifting of the partial arms embargo against Israel, including the 2,000-pound bombs. At the same time, it was announced over the last several days, a $7 billion arms package to Israel. The U.S. State Department notifying Congress about its plan to sell $7 billion worth of weapons to Jerusalem on the backdrop of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to the White House last week. The plan consists of two separate plans submitted to Congress last Friday, and all these different types of munitions. So another one of the accomplishments, no coincidence here that this announced as Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington meeting with the president. Another one of the accomplishments, and we'll get to a few other things that happened in Washington.
I want to talk about one other really important point, because now we're starting to see with this ceasefire, we're starting to see the pictures, the drone footage of just how vast the devastation is in the Gaza Strip. And I think that even for many Israelis, we're surprised by just how good a job Israel did inside the Gaza Strip. I mean, literally let's say 60, 70% of Gaza is demolished. And I think that it is something that Israelis never imagined that the IDF would ever do, right? Even though the October 7th attack really warranted that. Especially because, as the prime minister said during his briefing, the reason why all these buildings have been demolished was really Hamas's own doing, because they were booby-trapping the buildings in the Gaza Strip. He explained the situation in which sometimes the IDF would lay TNT in the street and explode it, and then all of a sudden, all of this booby-trapped ordnance would explode inside the buildings. Now, we know that the IDF also destroyed buildings one by one in Gaza, but we also know that each of these buildings were used as entrances to tunnels, storage for weapons, and in some cases also prisoners for hostages. But now that the images are coming out and the Trump administration saying that Gaza is a demolition zone, okay, you can only imagine what the situation would be right now if Kamala Harris, an adversarial president, had entered the White House. We see how the ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, who was the former defense minister. You see how the UN Security Council resolution against Israel was always looming in the backdrop and believed that this could come against Israel at any time. And what Trump's arrival into office does is it prevents this diplomatic avalanche against the state of Israel. I mean, we can only imagine how bad the situation could have gotten. I think that Israel not only would not get resupplied from the United States, but that you could have seen calls for a complete weapons embargo against the state of Israel if Harris had won the presidency. You would have seen UN Security Council resolutions against Israel. And I think you ultimately even would have seen harsh economic sanctions issued against Israel, not against Iran, not against the Palestinian Authority, but even issued against Israel for the job that it has done in the Gaza Strip. So, I think that Israel should be very, very grateful that President Trump is in office right now. And even if there are some kind of disagreements over policy, and there might be, and I think that Israel should expect that there will be, quite frankly, but Israel's being protected right now by the United States in a way that they were not going to be protected if Trump hadn't won.
You also had, by the way, to add to that, you had IDF soldiers on ski vacations worried that they would be arrested in foreign countries.
Exactly.
And that's not the reality anymore. Thank God they don't have to worry about things like that. At the same time, we talked about the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. You mentioned the ICC. At the same time, President Trump signing an executive order imposing sanctions, not on Israel, but on the ICC over investigations of Israel, a close U.S. ally. The order Trump signed Thursday accusing the ICC of engaging in, quote, illegitimate and baseless actions targeting America and our close ally Israel, and of abusing its power by issuing baseless arrest warrants against Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, not only concerned about Israel, but also taking America's interests into mind, concern that the ICC perhaps would go start targeting Americans as well.
Exactly. And the prime minister, he doubled down on that point, and he said this isn't just a threat to Israel, this is a threat to all democracies around the world. You have a court that does not have jurisdiction over Israel, does not have jurisdiction over the United States, and basically assigning itself jurisdiction, as we're seeing both in the United States and in Israel, the criminalization of political processes, right? Where here in Israel, you have the prime minister under trial as he's the sitting prime minister, for crimes that, he's described as, charges that are all falling apart. We saw the same thing in the United States where, where prosecutors were just coming up with whatever charges they could against the president of the United States to try to prevent him from winning the election. And here you have the ICC basically doing the same thing, assigning itself jurisdiction where it doesn't have it. And the idea that the threat of arrest warrants basically would prevent democracies from being able to defend themselves militarily because its leaders would be afraid of prosecution. So, I think the prime minister making an important point, and obviously President Trump agreeing with that. And let's see what happens. Perhaps the ICC will rescind its arrest warrants. The prime minister also doubling down on the point that the head of the ICC, the chief prosecutor, I believe Karim Khan, that he was charged with sexual misconduct. And so because these charges were coming down the pipeline, that he actually issued the arrest warrants to gain the sympathy of the international community before his own improprieties came to light, and and he became charged himself. So here you see, really not just corruption in terms of ideology, but even corruption itself with regards to the chief prosecutor of the ICC.
And if that wasn't enough, President Trump announcing that the United States was going to withdraw from the UN human rights body, and also will not resume funding for UNRWA, the UN agency supposed to be helping so-called Palestinian refugees and their descendants. So another 2 wins there for the United States, Israel, and really the world community there, pulling out of both of those bodies.
UNRWA really like the international political arm of Hamas.
Yeah, really humanitarian wing of Hamas.
Right. Yeah, sure. And the chief inciter to violence. But then also we saw this week big headlines coming out of the United States that Trump is shutting down U.S. aid. And we've seen that U.S. aid was working together with UNRWA, that U.S. aid we're seeing the first reports that they were putting money into the Kaplan Force protests against the prime minister, against judicial reforms here in Israel. A lot of money, maybe as much as 14 million shekels. And we also saw that the U.S. aid was putting money into progressive journalistic outfits, including Politico and others. I can report here first that JNS was not receiving any money from U.S. aid. I'm not going to assure you of that. But, I think that Trump really understanding, that the United States is operating at a horrific deficit, right? A governmental deficit, and wants to try to get much closer to a balanced budget, which I think will restore the strength of the United States. But on the other side, really just taking money away from all of these corrupt agencies and really correcting what I think is a significant injustice, that the United States was putting money into these organizations that were harming U.S. interests and were definitely harming Israeli interests.
There's one more here, and maybe I've missed some because there were so many to follow over the past week. President Trump signing an executive order cutting financial assistance to South Africa, the White House said on Friday, citing disapproval of its land policy and its genocide case at the International Court of Justice against Washington's ally Israel. So South Africa, remember the hypocrisy of South Africa going against the state of Israel, accusing Israel of genocide and all these other things, apartheid. Imagine that, South Africa accusing Israel of apartheid, the country which created apartheid, going after Israel at the ICJ, and now President Trump sticking it to South Africa.
Well, South Africa, it was reported, and we'll have to check these reports, but it was reported that South Africa was receiving funding from Iran for advancing the case against Israel for genocide at the International Criminal Court, right? Even though not only did Israel not conduct a genocide, but Israel went to lengths that no military has in the history of warfare to prevent the killing of Palestinian civilians, moving them out of harm's way. And you could see how Israel really pivoted from a strategy where they were specifically not trying to kill Palestinian civilians, choosing instead to destroy the infrastructure of the Gaza Strip. And I actually think that in doing so, and maybe they did it because the United States demanded it, but by destroying the infrastructure, destroying the buildings, and not killing Palestinians, they avoided, horrific genocide charge. And I don't think that Israel wanted to commit genocide in the Gaza Strip, but they've done something which I think is more powerful. And I think this is a really, important point here, which is that when you kill Palestinians, you turn them into so-called martyrs. In the society, anytime a Palestinian is killed, in the act of committing terror, against Israel, they become martyrs and they become honored in the society. You have streets named after terrorists in the Palestinian areas. Because that's a great honor in their society to be killed by the IDF. And here what we've done by destroying the Gaza Strip, which we know was not the open air prison, right? It's like on the one hand, everybody calls Gaza the open air prison. And then when Israel destroys it, they say, oh, you destroyed our palace, right? Which one is it? It's, so this is always what happens here. But what Israel has done is humiliated the Palestinian people, okay, for participating in the October 7th attack, for supporting Hamas, for voting in Hamas, for allowing their homes to be used for weapons and tunnels. And now the Palestinian people have been utterly humiliated by the IDF. And I think that it is a humiliation that's going to go down in history. And, I just think that, I'm very proud, actually, when I see the images of what Israel's done in the Gaza Strip. I think a lot of people in Israel were unsure whether the political leadership in Israel would, and the military leadership would be willing to have what Netanyahu was calling a total victory. I think now we're starting to see total victory has really come into focus, and partially because now the Trump administration is in power. But when you see what Israel's done to punish the Gazan people for October 7th, which they deserved, when you see now Trump talking about the relocation of the Palestinians out of Gaza, it's just the utter humiliation. It's the best punishment that you can give to a society in which honor and shame are the two guiding features of the culture.
We have time for one last story here, and if I'm not mistaken, you have some exclusive JNS reporting directly from Prime Minister Netanyahu in regard to Lebanon, yes? The IDF strikes Lebanon over the weekend. Israeli Air Force jets carried out strikes in eastern Lebanon's Bekaa Valley on Saturday, according to the military, targeting Hezbollah operatives at a weapons manufacturing site. Remember, we have a precarious ceasefire with Lebanon right now. Lebanon State News Agency reported 6 dead and 2 wounded in the strike. You have some information, yes, directly from the Prime Minister?
I did get to ask the Prime Minister a question during the press briefing, and he gave a very thorough, comprehensive briefing to the press. One issue which he left out was really a deep discussion on what was taking place in Lebanon. I asked the Prime Minister specifically, noting that when he declared the ceasefire in Lebanon, that he said it was a temporary ceasefire and that Israel would resume fighting, at the end of the 60-day drawdown period. Now, we're already past the 60-day drawdown period. The IDF has not drawn all the way down. I don't think the Trump administration is demanding that Israel draw down. But the Prime Minister said that, quote, the ceasefire is holding, although at the same time, he also said that Israel is militarily enforcing the ceasefire in southern Lebanon. He said that Israel would maintain its positions in southern Lebanon, and that enforcing the ceasefire, I think what he means is preventing the rebuilding of Hezbollah armaments in the southern sections of Lebanon. He said it's keeping Lebanon safer, it's keeping Israel safer. And then he went on to say that, Israel has changed Lebanon, and he told JNS, we have changed the Middle East, and we will continue to change the Middle East in the weeks and months ahead.
And on that note, that's all the time we have for today. Alex, catch up on your sleep, and a lot more to come here. Plenty of news out of Israel as we move forward. And we'll have to see what we have in store for us ahead as Israel perhaps heads towards phase 2 of the ceasefire in Gaza, situation in Lebanon, and throughout Israel and the Middle East. My name is Josh Hasten, coming to you from our beautiful JNS studios, along with Alex Traiman. It's great to be back in studio with you. Shout out to our production team, Zach Sickerman, Ryan Lifshitz, Aviai Asner, and Yuri Svritsky. Keep it logged on to JNS TV on YouTube, and go to jns.org for all the latest news from Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. Continue to pray for the well-being of our brave men and women of the IDF who are keeping us safe 24/7. Have a great week, everybody. See you on next week's Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV.